Greetings, bookworms of Concord. Pastor Beckett here, or Hallowed Autistic, if you follow me on TikTok. I just finished Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein. I hope that's how you say it. Sorry if I'm butchering it. And the first thing is first. The book is absolutely nothing like the movie. And usually, I knew that going into the book, and usually I would be quite upset that a movie completely strays from the book, but I'm not in this case for two reasons. The first has to do with, after reading it, if the movie were exactly like the book or close enough, then it would have been a really boring movie. Because there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of philosophy in here. And that has to do with the controversies, which I'll get to in a moment. But the second reason is because I remember watching videos of somebody covering the movie and why it's so different than the book. And that was apparently the intention of the director. He wanted it to be way different, and at least according to that person who did the research, whether or not they're right, I'm not sure, but they said the director did that on purpose because he wanted to piss off the fans of the book. Again, I don't know if that's true. Either way, it's meant to be, the movie is meant to be a satire on militarism and fascism, and the movie itself, it's pretty funny. It's very fun to watch. I remember seeing it, I might have been 11 or 12 years old. I was at my best friend's house, and it scared the heck out of me. And now my cat is going crazy in another video. It is late at night because I just finished it. Anyway, so I just want to get that out of the way. The second thing is that the main thing I really appreciated about the book is how it emphasizes military culture. And there's no better way to put it than how this one review put it that's inside the book by sfreviews.net. It says, what makes Starship Troopers such an important book is in its pioneering approach to dramatizing military themes in an SF science fiction context. Unless I miss my guess, Troopers was the first SF novel in which military life was depicted in a manner believable to readers who had actually served. And there's more to it in that review, but yeah, as an Army veteran myself, I absolutely agree. And because this is more of an in-depth review than my TikTok video, I'll be saving that for when I get into the specifics. The last thing I'll mention before getting into the controversies is that the one other thing I really liked about this book is how Heinlein doesn't tell you everything there is. Or he doesn't tell you everything you need to know. And I'm only aware of this because I recently watched a video by Library of a Viking. I believe that's what it's called. What his channel is called. And of course, I'm not on the YouTube channel anymore. But yeah, Library of a Viking. I was right. He has this video of, I believe it's called What Modern Fantasy Gets Wrong. And he talks about many things in there, but the main thing is that a lot of modern fantasy writers will tell you everything you need to know about, say, well, not just characters, but say the magic system in the book. Whereas a lot of older or classic fantasy novels, like The Lord of the Rings, for example, what makes them so great is that the authors don't tell you everything you need to know. For example, Tom Bombadil in the first Lord of the Rings book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Who the heck is he? Like he plays this like significant part in the first part of the book, and you have no idea who he is. It's not explained, and like when you read it, you either hate him or you love him. Like there's no in between. he's not fully explained, and with Gandalf, his magic and the magic of all the wizards, their magic system isn't entirely explained. We don't really know just how powerful they are, at least exactly. It's a mystery. And the Library of a Viking, he says this: mystery adds to the richness of of the universe. And I completely agree with him. And so there's some of that in here where there are some things, some sci-fi things that just aren't entirely explained, and that mystery just adds to the richness of the universe. So now we will get into the specific controversies, and this is going to be the main part of my review on here, because right on the front it says the controversial classic of military adventures. And when I saw that, I'm like, this is a military sci-fi. How could it possibly be controversial? And boy, was I in for a surprise. It's very obviously controversial. And the way I'm going to talk about these controversies, as well as what I mentioned about the military culture aspects that I appreciated, is simply by reading some quotes. I have a very autistic way of writing down quotes in books that just stick out to me, and quotes I like, whether they make me laugh or have to do with certain themes. So that's how I'm going to talk about them. The first being is right on page 4, and this has to do with military culture. Well, I guess this actually is controversial, but not as... It doesn't have as much profundity as, well, maybe, as the other controversies. So anyway, how can a chaplain bless anything he's not willing to do himself? And this is a rumination of the protagonist, Johnny. The chaplain is blessing them before, if I remember correctly, before they're going out to do a military exercise. And in this universe of Starship Troopers, the chaplains actually fight. They fight alongside the soldiers, whereas in the American military, the chaplains are not allowed to fight, to fire a weapon. They have chaplain assistants to do that for them. They're in a combat situation, at least. If a chaplain finds himself in a combat situation, their primary duty is to protect the chaplain, besides assisting him in the ministry. And because he is an officer, it's of course everybody else's job to protect the chaplain as well. And having served as an enlisted personnel, I can't help but agree with Johnny here. How can a chaplain bless anything he's not willing to do himself? Because having been an enlisted personnel, my original goal was to become an Army chaplain. And I knew that chaplains can't fire, let alone carry a weapon. And that always bothered me because, well, one, if I'm getting shot at, I don't want to 100% rely on somebody else. And the second thing is because of what he says. As a pastor, one of my, I don't know if you call it philosophy, but one of my main things is I will never ask a congregation to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. For example, if I'm going to encourage them to pray on a daily basis, I ought to do that myself. If I don't pray on a daily basis, I shouldn't. Why should I teach that? And so on and so forth. So it's the same thing with that. How can I, as a pastor or chaplain, bless a soldier when he's going to go out into battle if I'm not willing to do battle myself? That's just my view. You can disagree. That's up to you. The next quote is, so this has to do with, I guess, Heinlein's view on war. This is said by Sergeant Zim in the book. War is not violence and killing, pure and simple. War is controlled violence for a purpose. The purpose of war is to support your government's decisions by force. The purpose is never to kill the enemy just to be killing him, but to make him do what you want him to do. But it's not your business or mine to decide the purpose of the control. It's never a soldier's business to decide when or where or how or why he fights. That belongs to the statesmen and the generals. So, if you're a civilian, this might be difficult to understand. And the philosophy here can be disagreeable that it's basically, a soldier obeys without question. And in the American military, this is true to an extent. Now, we literally take a vow when we're sworn in. We vow to, among other things, to obey our officers and who are our president, the president of the United States appoints, and to obey the president himself, really without question, unless it's immoral, unless you receive an immoral command, right? Such as lining up a bunch of innocents and killing them. That's an extreme example, but one that works nonetheless. So yeah, that's the idea it's getting at, but at least in this universe, it's that to the extreme. The next quote is, this was the tragic fallacy which brought on the decadence and collapse of the democracies of the 20th century. Those noble experiments failed because the people had been led to believe that they could simply vote for whatever they wanted and get it, without toil, without sweat, without tears. Nothing of value is free. Even the breath of life is purchased at birth. Even the breath of life is purchased at birth only through gasping effort and pain. So this is said by Johnny's history and moral philosophy teacher, and I guess what would be the equivalent of our high school, Mr. Dubois, or who we find out to be Lieutenant Colonel Dubois. And I found this a fascinating quote, because, well, he's criticizing democracy here, especially that of the 20th century, i.e., American democracy, any democracy that exists in Europe. But this should not be read as his support for communism either. This was published in 1959, the book, first published, and so communism was still a thing then. But he criticizes democracy, but he also does not advocate for communism, because in an earlier quote, just one to two pages before this, he calls communism a fallacy and magnificent fraud. So he's just pointing out some contradictions that are prevalent, that are present in democracy. And there are other quotes where he gets more into that. But I want to go to the next quote, which was, I think, a very important quote. He says, this is also Dubois. He says, "I pity the poverty of your wealth. The best things in life are beyond money. Their price is agony and sweat and devotion. And the price demanded for the most precious of all things in life is life itself. Ultimate cost for perfect value." So as a pastor, to me, that's not just philosophical, that's also very theological. it's a great quote that, on the whole, speaks of the necessity of suffering in our lives. It is part of a larger philosophical discussion that Johnny is having with Mr. Dubois on whether value is absolute or relative. Dubois argues for the latter, emphasizing the point to Johnny by saying if he, Dubois, wrote out the grand prize for the championship of the 100-meter sprint, would Johnny value it? And he says no, because Dubois knows perfectly well that he placed fourth. And Dubois retorts, exactly, because the prize for first place is worthless to Johnny because he hasn't earned it. Even though fourth place is obviously not the best place, he values that even more because he agonized, sweated, and devoted himself to it. He suffered for it. So this is why, as a minor example, participation trophies are worthless, because it requires no agony, sweat, or toil, or devotion. The most valuable things in life require suffering of some kind. If you want that college degree, you'll have to suffer for it. If you want that dream job, you'll have to suffer for it. If you want a good marriage, devout children, freedom, whether financial or civil freedom, you'll have to suffer for it. In the latter part of the quote, I couldn't help but think of Christ. It's the price demanded for the most precious of all things in life is life itself. Ultimate cost for perfect value. Now, since my mental health issues and suffering this has brought on, both my depression and my forced resignation, because my former parish could not, they were unwilling to make accommodations for my mental health issues, I've nevertheless been blessed with insights on how the gospel speaks to mental health, especially depression. Truly depressed people are overwhelmed with a sense of worthlessness. And the gospel of Jesus Christ speaks perfectly to these feelings. Because if we were truly worthless, Christ would not have died and subsequently rose for us, for you. Life is our most precious and valuable commodity. It is so precious that, we have more laws protecting the lives of children than we do adults. Indeed, so valuable that some states require capital punishment for murder. Life is so valuable that in order to preserve the lives of others in the face of evil, it requires the sacrifice of life itself. Hence, soldiers in war, right? And now bringing this to Christ, the value of redeeming your life from sin, death, and the devil is so valuable that it required God to become human. And for himself to suffer for you, while bearing the suffering of every human being to ever exist, including yours, and then die with that impossible weight, which shows how much the God of the entire universe values you. Yes, you, this little dot on a little blue planet in an infinite universe. So, value might be relative to us, and thus we might place little value on our own lives, but for God, whose truth is absolute, he places absolute value on you. And because of that, he was willing to give his most precious thing, the life of his only begotten Son, for your life. The ultimate cost, Jesus, for perfect value, you. So, my little sermonette's over. I just had to just get that out there. I thought that point of the quote was not just philosophical, but also deeply theological. So the next quote, this is, again, Dubois. I have a lot of quotes by Dubois and another history, moral philosophy teacher Johnny has. He says, I do not understand objections to cruel and unusual punishment. while a judge should be benevolent in purpose, I can't read my own writing. Oh, yeah. While a judge should be benevolent in purpose, his awards should cause the criminal to suffer, else there is no punishment. As for unusual, punishment must be unusual, or it serves no purpose. I'm not really going to say much about that because, you heard it. If that doesn't sound controversial to you, then I don't know. But this actually is an embellishment on a quote by Winston Churchill. I wrote down the quote, so let me see if I can find it. Oh, yeah, Winston Churchill, he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Actually, the quote before that is an embellishment on Winston Churchill, the one I gave a sermon about. So I'll just leave that there, about cruel and unusual punishment. It obviously Heinlein seems to be for it. If he truly did support the views for which the characters in here are arguing for, again, if the judgment or the sentence is not cruel, then it's not punishment. They're not really being punished, and it must be unusual, otherwise it serves no purpose. So yeah, I'll just leave that there. Tell me what you think about that. Next one. A human being has no natural rights of any nature. Now, we are Americans. We love our rights, right? So, a human being has no natural rights of any nature. In other words, rights don't exist. And before I get into what I'm going to say about that, I'm not going to read all the quotes about it, but just very specifically, what about the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What about those unalienable rights? Well, Mr. Dubois has thoughts about that as well. He says, life? What right to life has a man who is drowning in the Pacific? The ocean will not hearken to his cries. What right to life has a man who must die if he is to save his children? If he chooses to save his own life, does he do so as a matter of right? If two men are starving and cannibalism is the only alternative to death, which man's life is unalienable? And is it right? As to liberty, the heroes who signed the great document, the Constitution, pledged themselves to buy liberty with their lives. Liberty is never unalienable. It must be redeemed regularly with the blood of patriots, or it always vanishes. The pursuit of happiness? It is indeed unalienable, but it is not a right. It is simply a universal condition which tyrants cannot take away, nor patriots restore. And that's the quote. And what he says about liberty that is actually bought with our lives it actually comes from Thomas Jefferson, who said in 1787, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots." So he's expressing the larger idea that, like I said, rights don't really exist. We don't really have a right to anything. And I agree with him. And this is because I read this essay in my pre-seminary studies by the Reverend Dr. Joel Bierman. It's an essay in a larger book. That's a collection of essays. Well, not really a larger book. The book is short. But the book is called The American Mind Meets the Mind of Christ. And this essay written by Dr. Bierman is individualism as the insistence on my rights. And he says, today's Lord and Master has become the sacred individual, right? It's not God. It's not Christ. It's not the Holy Spirit. It is the sacred individual. I always like to call it the false trinity of me, myself, and I. And he says, to demand one's right, yes, even to demand the rights of another, invariably ends with the individual self enthroned and both God and neighbor deposed. So, as man grows in his sense of strong individualism, this is Bierman's argument, which I just so happen to agree with. As a man grows in a sense of strong individualism, the further he declines into moral relativism. In moral relativism, anything becomes good, right, or true based on the individual's desires, and in the process deposes God and neighbor. And this is where a philosophy called deconstructionism comes into play. I'm not talking about Christian deconstructionism, just the base philosophy. Deconstructionism is the philosophy that there can be no dependence on arbitrary signifiers because of their ultimate instability, such as the subjectivity of a collective people defining what is true or good. There are a plethora of biases with one's upbringing as that foundation, and any understanding of a truth is always shaped by one's bias so much that we can never be able to get to the kernel of the truth. Therefore, in a worldview run by subjectivity, i.e. the subjective majority with the loudest voice, we can never say there is truth, because we each have a different bias, and someone else's will always be different from ours. So truth then becomes irrelevant, and what becomes relevant is what is right for each person, i.e. individualism, which when left unchecked falls into moral relativism, also known as consequentialism. And then Bierman says this. He says, man invents the rights he likes and asserts the dignity he wants. Rights are what someone, the one with the most power, the majority, deigns to give to you. Therefore, without a creator, talk of human dignity and human rights is nonsensical. So moral relativism, which the insistence on our rights falls into, seeks to respond to the human condition of sin, just like any other religion attempts. And the failure of moral relativism is that it focuses on the self, me, myself, and I. What is good, right, and true for the individual comes from within, and that is what saves them. Scripture, however, does not speak this way about salvation. If there are multiple ways in which a person can save him or herself, then it is questionable whether man really needs saving at all, since the plethora of salvation methods are apparently equal. Perhaps the most significant failure of moral relativism is that while it demands a right for oneself and or the rights of others, it at the same time denies the rights of the minority. And we are seeing this play out already. For example, the insistence on gay rights has inevitably led to the deposition of Christian neighbors. The rights of religious freedom are deposed in many cases, so much so that we are essentially on the verge of losing our religious rights. So where do rights really come from? whose rights matter the most. The rights that matter the most tends to come from the majority. I was when I was still the campus pastor at Christ the King Lutheran Chapel at Central Michigan University. I had mentored a young man who is currently at the seminary, and he had the unfortunate experience during his master's program at Michigan State, where I'm not going to get into all the specifics, but he was essentially targeted by the leftist students there, and he was accused of sexual harassment simply because he said he does not believe in two genders, because he does not believe in more than two genders. And he was brought before some of the professors, and they literally silenced him. They said, you're not allowed to speak in class anymore. And he told me that one of the professors literally told him that sexual rights are more important than religious rights. So I'll just leave that there. Let's go on to the next quote. The change of subject. You don't win a war by defense, but by attack. No Department of Defense ever won a war. See the histories. But it seems to be a standard civilian reaction to scream for defensive tactics as soon as they do notice a war. They then want to run the war, like a passenger trying to grab the controls away from the pilot in an emergency. I'm not really going to say much about that, except just think of the Vietnam protests. As soon as civilians hear about a war, all of a sudden they want to run it. Next one. This is getting to more deeper stuff having to do with the way the government is set up in this universe. I'll get into that more after I read these quotes. This is said by a character named Major Reed. To vote is to wield authority. It is the supreme authority from which all other authority arrives. And it continues, since sovereign franchise is the ultimate in human authority, we ensure that all who wield it accept the ultimate in social responsibility. We require each person who wishes to exert control over the state to wage his own life and lose it if need be to save the life of the state. So the government, I'm not sure if there's an exact name of the type of government, but it's basically a military service requirement in order to become a citizen and therefore be able to vote. A person has to serve for a minimum of 2 terms in the military to become a citizen and vote. And at the same time, because of that, they make it so difficult to enlist, but also really easy to resign. And one cannot vote while they're serving. So again, that first quote, to vote is to wield authority. It is the supreme authority from which all other authority arrives. And according to the American Constitution, I think we would agree. We the people, right? Our government, in theory at least, is not run by the powers that be, but by the people, by those who vote. We are the bosses. We're supposed to tell the government what to do, not the other way around. At least that's how it's supposed to work. It can be argued that that's not how it works, but that's another conversation. And throughout the book, as we saw in one quote already, the democracies of the 20th century were just colossal failures. So much so that democracy no longer exists. Rather, it's this type of government, whatever you would call it. And the reason for their strictness of having to serve a minimum of 2 years in the military, which is really hard to get into in order to become a civilian and vote, has to do with, I would say, the philosophy of utilitarianism, the greater good, right? And it's said right here, right there in that second quote I read. We ensure that all who wield the ultimate human authority, that is, accept the ultimate in social responsibility. We require each person who wishes to exert control over the state to wage his own life and lose it if need be to save the life of the state. So by serving a minimum of 2 terms in the military, you have proven that you will put the good of all, the good of the state, the good of every human being that exists over your personal advantage, then this proves that you have the right to vote. Because if you're willing to give your own life for the greater good rather than save your own life for the sake of personal advantage, then they believe that you will vote in the same way, that you will vote for the greater good rather than personal advantage. Now, here's where it becomes tricky. On paper, I like that idea, right? On paper, that sounds nice. But in practice, is it really practical? Could it actually work? I'm not entirely sure. It's the same thing with communism. I mean, communism is the attempt to put into practice the philosophy of Marxism. And Marxism, if you've read the Communist Manifesto, if you've read Karl Marx, which I have, on paper it sounds really nice, but in practice it just doesn't work. It's, as we know from history, communism is a complete and utter colossal failure. It just cannot work. And I believe that's because theologically having to do with sin. And I cannot help but think that it'd be the same thing with the way that the government functions in this, the society that Heinlein has written here. On paper, what he says about voting and so forth for the greater good, it sounds nice. It's a good philosophy, but will it work? I'm not convinced. So that's all I have to say about Starship Troopers. Excellent book, 5 stars out of 5. It will definitely challenge your own views philosophically and politically, and at least for me, it's quite, when you're reading about those things, it's quite cerebral. But what's the point of reading if you don't learn something? So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this review. In the meantime, may God bless your reading. Okay, bye.